Thank you for joining the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Houston for our weekly online ministers forum. I'm the Reverend D. Scott Cooper, Assistant Minister of Congregational Life, filling in for Dr. Bosson, who is away this week. These programs are conversations with community organizers, artists, scholars, religious leaders, and others about how we can collectively address the present issues. Their purpose is to offer members of our community and all who wish to join us online science-based resources. Today, I'm talking to Brad Pritchitt, a field director for Equality Texas. Equality Texas works to secure full equality for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer Texans through political action, education, community organizing, and collaboration. So, Brad, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation. I'm happy to take time to talk with you.
Well, we're excited to hear about what all that you do there at Equality Texas. And I understand it began in 1978 when a group of lesbians and gay men recognized the need to have their interests represented in the 66th session of the Texas Legislature. So if you would, tell us a little more about Equality Texas history and their mission.
So, in the late 1970s / into the 1980s and even up until today, the Texas Legislature hasn't always been a very welcoming place for members of the LGBTQ plus community. Up until, very recent legislative sessions, we haven't had a lot of folks who were elected to the legislature who were willing to go to bat on LGBTQ issues. Thankfully, that's changed today. But in the 1970s, in 1978, folks came together and basically were working to try to combat a specific series of proposals that would have made it more difficult for LGBTQ organizations to exist on college campuses in Texas. So through that legislative session, there was a recognition that there's this old saying, if you don't have a seat at the table, then you're on the menu, wanting to ensure that LGBTQ folks were actively engaged in what was happening in the Texas Legislature. So that organization evolved over the years, and in the 1980s, around 1986, became the Lesbian Gay Rights Lobby of Texas. And it was an organization that continued to have full-time representation at the legislature. In 1986, it had grown enough and built enough resources to hire a full-time executive director to run the organization. And kind of kept a presence at the legislature, fighting on behalf of LGBTQ folks. Again, in the 1980s, we had a lot of compounding crises as a community that needed to be addressed within the community and with lawmakers as well. And the Lesbian Gay Rights Lobby existed until 2006 when it formally became Equality Texas. And it's been Equality Texas ever since. So the mission of the organization, I think, has expanded somewhat. Initially, the organization was designed to engage with the legislature. Today, we engage at the legislature, but we engage at multiple levels. So we are doing work at the legislature, which is probably the thing folks know us most for. But we also do a lot of other work that maybe we're not as well known for. So we take a lot of intakes right now from schools across the state of Texas. We have done community organizing as an organization for years and years and years, and have really just been working throughout the existence of the organization to try to build power for LGBTQ folks here in the state of Texas. So today we are probably at our largest point ever, as far as having a staff that is kind of spread out across the state of Texas. And having thousands of folks who we consider Equality Texans in every corner of our state. Because believe it or not, we're everywhere LGBTQ folks. We are in every corner of the state of Texas, whether you're talking urban areas or rural areas, we exist everywhere. And Equality Texas is committed to ensuring that the interests of LGBTQ folks are being met and that we are holding the line against discriminatory legislation, policies, activities, in any way that we can here in the state of Texas.
That's great. You were talking about the staff and how you're bigger than you've been before. Tell us about specifically what you do as a member of the staff. You're the field director.
I really look at my job as the primary purpose being to find ways to empower Texans to use their power and use their voices to advocate on behalf of themselves and the communities that they are a part of. When we talk about field, what we generally are talking about is how do we move people to take action? How do we take people who may have never gone to the legislature, have never testified in front of a body like the legislature or like a city council or a school board even, and give them the tools that they need to do that successfully and feel supported throughout the process of it. And a lot of what I'm working on is recruitment, finding places in Texas where LGBTQ folks have felt traditionally underrepresented or unsupported, and finding ways that we can engage those communities and make them feel like a part of the broader community that they are part of, and give them the tools that they need to advocate on their own behalf. We don't want people to feel like they need to come to Equality Texas when something's happening in their community. We want them to do that, but we also want them to feel empowered enough to tackle issues on their own, and then come to us and say, "We're leading this. We need your support." So a lot of what I'm working on is figuring out ways for us to just make sure that Texans know what their rights are, know how to exercise those rights, and to ensure that they have the support that they need from a statewide organization like Equality Texas.
That's great. That's great. And like you said, your reach has expanded. One of the things I kind of didn't expect, but I was really impressed by, when I went to the website, equalitytexas.org, there was this impressive list of links to resources related to the pandemic, from physical and mental health resources to resources for undocumented people. Hopefully, we're seeing light at the end of the tunnel with the worst of COVID, but you all certainly provided a great service there. Tell us a little bit about that outreach.
COVID made it really complicated for a lot of reasons for LGBTQ folks. One of the things I'll say, and I'll dig more into some of the other ways that we were adjusting to the pandemic. But when the legislature started this session, we kind of didn't know what to expect. In sessions past, we've been able to stop bad bills or elevate our issues as a legislature by mobilizing people in large numbers to go to the Capitol. And at the beginning of this year, it didn't seem like that was going to be possible because of the pandemic, and because a lot of the people who are in power weren't taking the pandemic as seriously as we had hoped that they would. So we weren't really sure what that was going to look like during the legislature. Thankfully, vaccination rates started to go up. We had members of our community who reached out and let us know when they were vaccinated and told us that they were good to go. They were willing to go to the Capitol. So thankfully that happened. But the pandemic overall, I think, changed the way we looked at how do we support LGBTQ folks in Texas with yet another disproportionately impactful event that is hitting our community. So what we know is that, the jobs that were impacted by COVID-19 are jobs that LGBTQ people are more likely to have. So things like food service, working in restaurants, being educators, retail work, hospitals, working as first responders. Like, these were all areas that we knew LGBTQ people are employed in and were impacted heavily by the pandemic. So one of the things that we did is we worked with Texas Pride Impact Funds to create the Queer Texas Crisis Fund, which our goal is to raise $100,000 by September and then disperse those funds to local nonprofit organizations across the state that are providing direct assistance throughout the pandemic, emergency relief assistance throughout the pandemic. The pandemic impacts LGBTQ people at higher rates, I think, than cis and straight counterparts. And part of that's because there's already disproportionate impact on LGBTQ folks in a lot of other areas of life. So when we think about people who are living in poverty, 1 in 5 LGBTQ folks lives in poverty, compared to a much lower number among straight or cisgender folks. And those poverty rates just increase when you start adding layers of compounded discrimination. So if you're an LGBTQ person, you may have a higher risk of living in poverty, but if you're an LGBTQ person who is also transgender and who is also a person of color, the numbers of folks who are living in poverty increase as you add those levels of compounded discrimination. So we were already seeing folks who were unemployed or underemployed at higher levels because of being LGBTQ, and then the pandemic kind of decimated the workforce that a lot of folks relied on. In addition to that, we were thinking about just the disparities in healthcare that exist. We, as an organization, get calls from folks, and we aren't necessarily the folks who can handle this, but we can refer them, reporting discrimination in healthcare. And a lot of LGBTQ folks avoid going to the doctor because they can't afford it. And then if you're somebody who identifies as trans or non-binary, and even folks who are LGB, you may avoid getting healthcare or having health issues dealt with by a professional because you're not 100% certain that you're going to get competent LGBTQ healthcare. So when we were talking about folks in the pandemic getting sick, it impacted our community more because we already have a history of not having competent healthcare, especially if you're living in rural areas of the state of Texas.
Respectful, let alone competent. I mean,
Yeah, competent healthcare is hard to get, and in some places in Texas, healthcare in general is hard to get. I'm in Houston, so I have Legacy Community Health I could go to if I needed to find competent LGBTQ healthcare. But when you think about folks who are living in rural parts of the state where they don't have healthcare providers that have been trained to deal with LGBTQ folks, it makes it even more complicated.
definitely.
So we worked with Texas Pride Impact Funds to create a crisis fund to ensure that LGBTQ folks had additional support throughout the pandemic, because we knew, as we've known from the history of LGBTQ folks, we have to take care of each other. And that was one of the ways that we wanted to make sure that folks had additional resources to ride the pandemic out and to get the resources they needed access to.
Now, we're going to talk up the website here in a couple of minutes, but can we find out about that special fund on the website? And how far along are you on that? How close to your goal? And can we donate through the website?
Yes, if you go to equalitytexas.org and you look under programs, you'll see the Queer Texas Crisis Fund will be the first option on our drop-down menu of programs. And there's a direct link that you can use to donate specifically to that fund. I don't know where we are on it. I'm not a finance person. So I will point people to the fund. I will talk up the fund, but I don't know where we are on the fund. But what I will say is that if we meet our goal, fantastic. If we exceed our goal, fantastic, because those funds will go to small nonprofits, 501c3s here in Texas that are doing that direct relief work with folks in different parts of the state.
That's great to know. You a minute ago you mentioned reaching out to schools. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
We have over 1,000 school districts across the state of Texas. I can't remember the exact number, but you can imagine in some places that are less urban, and even in places that are urban, the type of challenges LGBTQ students may be facing with educators. So we get a lot of calls from school districts, sometimes from teachers, sometimes from students themselves, just letting us know about issues they may be facing. And some of them are easier to deal with than others. So, for example, we had a recent call coming in from a student who wanted to graduate using their name, the name that they identify with, that may not be the same as the name that's on the roster that the school has. And
Not their dead name.
The school is giving them pushback about being called by their name.
Right.
And in some of those instances, it's as easy as us sending a letter saying, here's what you're required to do, and the school district will say, okay, we'll do it. And other times we may have to mobilize coalition partners who have additional weight, who may be able to convince school districts to do the right thing. But we've gotten a lot of calls from school districts and from students, and sadly, a lot of it is, I think, fed by the statewide climate that we see happening at the legislature sometimes. So this session, there were a lot of attacks on transgender students and transgender children. So we did see an increase in kind of the reports that we were getting from school districts about bullying and discrimination being levied at trans kids. And we do what we can to ensure that we're taking those reports in and finding ways to assist wherever we can. Like I said before, we're better known for our work at the legislature, and a lot of the times we're doing a lot of work that folks that may not be as front facing, that folks don't necessarily know we're taking on, and the work that we do with school districts to ensure that kids are being treated in an equitable and respectful way is one of those things. I don't think people know how much we actually work on, and it's probably one of the things that is the most important that we do, because we want to ensure that kids aren't being tormented just for being who they are while they go to school.
I'm just astonished at how things have changed, but it seems that people have gotten even meaner since I was a kid. And man, to have people stand up for kids like that is just invaluable. So thank you so much for that work.
I will say we partner with the Trans Education Network of Texas and the ACLU of Texas, to ensure that as we're getting these intakes in, each of our organizations, I think, has different skill sets that we can work together, or we can refer some of the reports that we get to these other organizations that are extraordinarily skilled at ensuring that school districts do the right thing. So any chance I can get to call out the Trans Education Network of Texas and the ACLU of Texas, I will take it, because they are extremely valuable partners, especially in the work that we do around schools and the legislature.
That's great that there's multiple groups standing up for vulnerable kids like that. So that's fabulous. Yeah, I'm glad you highlighted them as well. You just mentioned the legislature before we talk about all that went on this past year and all that's probably about to happen. On the website, it had this impressive list of victories that your group has had for years at the legislature, and I'd love to hear you talk about some of those.
Yeah, folks can always go to equalitytexas.org, and under the About Us section, we have a list of kind of historically some of the things that we've accomplished at the legislature. I think some of the big ones for me that come to mind, the James Burr Jr. Hate Crimes Act was amended to include sexual orientation. That was huge as far as being able to provide additional protection for LGBTQ folks. Equality Texas and our partners, working with our partners, has been extremely effective in holding the line against discriminatory policies and legislation that have attempted to be passed at the legislature. Every legislative session, for as long as I know, as long as I can remember, and as long as I've been involved in the legislature, we get multiple anti-LGBTQ bills that get filed. And in the past, a lot of them focused on things like marriage equality, or chipping away at local municipalities and their ability to protect LGBTQ folks through the passage of non-discrimination laws and policies locally. And Equality Texas has been very effective at helping to stop those bills from actually becoming law. And we see those every session. I think we see less of the marriage bills right now than we did in the past. We've been able to stop things like the use of religious freedom laws to allow for discrimination. These types of laws that get passed under the guise of protecting someone's religion, but in reality, the laws are really just a license to discriminate against LGBTQ folks using religion as the excuse. So Equality Texas, every session, is able to defeat those bills, and we do that with the help of partner organizations at the legislature. We do it with the help of legislators. We are fortunate right now to have a House LGBTQ caucus that is made up of members of our community who understand how these laws impact us. That wasn't always the case in the legislature. We didn't always have openly LGBTQ folks elected to office. Now we do. They're extremely effective at helping to stop some of these really bad bills. And we do it through the help of advocates and activists from across the state who are literally willing to trek from every corner of the state to Austin to testify against the bill, to show up for a rally, to meet with their lawmakers, and just to make their voices heard. And it honestly is a huge effort by all of us to stop the bad bills from passing and becoming law. Some of the good things that we've done at the legislature, not just stopping bad bills, is we've helped to increase people's understanding of the need to increase funding around programs that benefit HIV and AIDS programs. There, once upon a time, pro-LGBTQ bills would never even get a hearing in the legislature. I mean, I've been involved in work at the legislature since 2009. And back when I started, we would see pro-LGBTQ bills get filed, but they would never even get a hearing. So they would die in the process before anybody ever heard them. We are at a point now where bills are actually making it into committee hearings. There are robust discussions taking place around bills that would positively benefit LGBTQ folks. Things like statewide non-discrimination or non-discrimination in housing or employment. Things like cleaning up our penal code to ensure that there's no discriminatory language in it. Like the number of pro-LGBTQ bills that have been filed over the last few sessions has just continued to increase more and more and more. And their ability to move through the process has gotten better and better every session. So, like I said, when I started in 2009, somebody would file a pro-LGBTQ bill, and I would say, well, we're never going to see the light of day on that one. Now, some of those same bills that have been filed every session are actually getting hearings and moving further and further through the process. So it is slow, but it is forward-moving momentum. It's just not
It's
as
going in
fast.
the right direction.
It is going in the right direction. It's just not as fast as we would like it to be.
Right.
But we're not moving back. We are moving forward. So that is a really good thing. Um, so yeah, that's some of kind of how you look at the accomplishments of the legislature. We may not always get a bill passed, but we may be able to get a bill further through the process and continue to educate members who've been there for a long time, who've heard these bills come around multiple times and still don't have an understanding of why they're necessary. And the fact that they come back every session helps underscore why they're necessary.
Well, specifically this past year, there's certainly, as you indicated, that there was no shortage of really awful things aimed at the trans community. Tell us about all that happened there.
Yeah, the before the legislative session started this past session, we pretty much knew what we were going to be facing. You know, we have the same slate of bad bills that kind of get filed every session, and those bills, like I said before, generally attack local control over being able to protect LGBTQ folks, or they try to weaponize religion to hurt LGBTQ people. But before the session started, we knew that we were going to see the most vicious and horrible attacks on transgender kids that we've ever seen in the legislative session. Um, we had legislators before the session ever started who were going on social media and spreading just awful lies about trans healthcare and trans children, and pledging to pass legislation that would harm them. So we knew it was coming. We also we've been able to see, I won't say we're fortunate, but what we have seen in other legislatures across the country is a pattern where these bills are getting filed all across the country in a coordinated national attack. So we have seen it happen in multiple legislatures all across the country. Some of those legislatures bills passed. A lot of those legislatures bills didn't pass. So we knew we were going to see two specific types of attacks on trans kids. One was an attack on healthcare for trans kids. So gender affirming, life saving healthcare for trans kids, just cutting it off and saying that kids would not be able to get that affirming healthcare by medical providers. Um, and all the bills were terrible. Some of them were much more extreme than others. Some of them would have criminalized doctors and parents for providing their children with trans affirming healthcare. So literally, if you're the parent of a trans kid, you were being threatened with being called a child abuser for providing your kid with essential life-saving healthcare. If you were a doctor, you were being told that your license would be taken away from you, or that your insurance would be taken away from you, um, for providing a standard of care that is well documented across medical associations as the right standard of care for transgender kids. And a lot of what we saw on the healthcare front was lawmakers knowingly telling lies about what trans affirming healthcare is. You know, we talk about how kids transition, and any kid under the age of 18, for the most part, what a transition looks like for them is a social transition. It is being called by the appropriate name and the appropriate pronouns. It is dressing the way you're comfortable dressing. It's growing your hair to the length that you think is appropriate and you feel comfortable with. Um, and what we heard from lawmakers is just drastically dishonest rhetoric around trans inclusive healthcare, and completely ignorant as far as the actual science was concerned. when every medical association in the country has a standard of care for trans kids, and you have lawmakers who are not doctors and are not experts on this topic coming in and saying, these experts don't know what they're talking about. These experts have been doing this for decades, and these lawmakers have only been interested in this topic for the last year. So when we had hearings on the medical bills, we would bring medical professionals in who were endocrinologists, who were folks who had trans kids as patients, laying out what best care practices were. When you saw interactions between lawmakers who'd been spouting lies throughout the session with folks who were experts on it, it really just underscored how little these politicians knew about healthcare in general and how little they knew about trans healthcare specifically. So we had those medical bills that were filed. We had multiple bills there. And then we had a whole other slate of bills that attacked trans kids and their ability to play sports in Texas. So bills that would have banned trans kids from participating in sports in the appropriate league or based on who they were as a person. And our lieutenant governor made that a priority piece of legislation in the session, and luckily it did not make it to the floor of the House for a vote. It passed the Senate, but it didn't get through the House. And what I will say on that front is, we saw a spectacular display from our allies in the Texas House, both Democrats and Republicans, members of the House LGBTQ caucus, to make sure that bill did not come up for a vote by the deadline when it was necessary to be voted on. And, we worked with all these folks and coalition partners to try to make sure we were running that clock out and that bill would not even come to a vote. So thankfully we were successful in being able to make that happen. And the bill died, both the medical bills and the sports bills both died. And we made it through the session without a single one of the 30 plus anti-LGBTQ bills actually passing into law.
That's wonderful, but these people often have other things up their sleeve. I know that we have to prepare for a threatened special session. Talk about that.
There was a lot of unfinished work as far as the Republican leadership was concerned through this last legislative session. There were priority bills that both the lieutenant governor and the governor had laid out that did not pass, did not make it through the process. So we know for a fact that the governor is going to call a special session on redistricting because he'll have to. We believe he'll call a special session on federal dollars for COVID relief and how those dollars will be distributed and dispersed. And then we think that there will be another special session that may be around some of these pieces of legislation that he had prioritized that did not pass. So things like the voting bill that Texas Democrats were able to kill, which was a voter suppression bill and was harmful for democracy.
Right.
That bill did not pass. The governor will probably try to call a special session for that one. We don't know for sure that he will call a special session for any of the anti-trans bills. We're working very hard to ensure that the governor is hearing the voices of the parents of trans kids, members of the trans community, folks who identify as LGBTQ+, to help him make the right decision and not call a special session. So if folks want something to do, they can reach out to their lawmakers and let them know that there should not be a special session that impacts trans or LGBT folks here in Texas. So what we're doing right now is just preparing for the worst. Equality Texas is building a special session fund to replenish our bank account after the regular session, so that we're prepared to spring into action at a moment's notice if we are on a special session called by the governor. Right now we don't know, and we're just we're waiting to find out what the governor's going to do, and we're using this time to try to amplify the voices of folks who will be directly impacted if this bill or these bills come back during a special session.
I think we can reiterate that how important it is for people to contact their elected officials on things that they feel strongly about. I think that often carries more weight than people realize it does. And as you said, you're gearing back up, and we've mentioned the website. We're about to run out of time, but I definitely want you to talk about the website again. Give us the address and tell us how we can donate to the good work that you're doing.
So you can go to equalitytexas.org, and we make it really easy to find how to donate to us. You can contribute to our C3 or our C4. Our C3 work is more public education based. Our C4 work is going to be more lobbying or legislature based. And you can also go to equalitytexas.org and under programs find the Queer Texas Crisis Fund if you want to contribute there to help support LGBTQ folks across Texas during the COVID-19 pandemic.
That's great. There's no shortage of ways to help, so we encourage all those watching to do that. And I definitely thank you for spending this time with us and giving us lots of really good information about what's going on in the state and how your group is working to help the not just LGBTQ kids, but all of us in the state. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm super happy to have conversations whenever.
Okay, great. Well, for those of you who were with us on the Ministers Forum for the first time, let me say a few words about Unitarian Universalism. We are a religious tradition that celebrates the possibility of goodness within each human heart, the transformative power of love, and the clarifying force of reason. We believe that we need not think alike to love alike. We hope that you find these forums a source of connection, hope, and clarity. If you found this video to be helpful, please consider joining us for our weekly worship service. It's posted online each Sunday at 10:30 a.m. and features music and prayers in addition to a sermon. And we'll soon be meeting in person on July 11th, but this upcoming week you can watch the online service and I will be preaching. Thank you to all of our staff for making this video possible. It was produced by Christian Holmes. Alma Vizcarra assisted with the editing. We will see you all online soon and in person as soon as it is possible for us to gather again. And please remember that no matter how isolated you feel, we are all in this together.